Thank you and good morning to all of you here at the Community Unitarian Universalist Church. I want to give a special thanks to all of those who had some role or some part in my being here today. And certainly I want to thank all of you for being part of the service here this morning. I want to thank my co-pilot who rode with me today. She has been my co-pilot now for a long time. We are soon to be celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary. I have known my wife, Maureen. We have known each other since we were in kindergarten. Yeah, it's kindergarten. That's a long time to have been knowing someone and been with someone. But we've been through school together, elementary school and middle school, high school, and then we parted ways after high school. She went to the Air Force. I went to Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. And miraculously, God brought us back together. And we got married while I was still in college, and we've been married ever since. But it is a pleasure for me to be here today. And to Charlotte, in my faith tradition, I will certainly be praying for your family members and loved ones as you seek to visit with them and to encourage them. I'm here today, not in my role as a pastor, Christian pastor, but in my role as the president of the Volusia County Democratic Black Caucus. And today I wanted to speak with you. I was asked what I would like to share with you, and I wanted to talk about African Americans and voting rights. This is a challenging issue for those of us who are persons of color. And I'm delighted to speak with you about the ongoing challenges that we face as African Americans when it comes to voting. In the year 1900, there was a small, about 10-page pamphlet that was written, and you can still find it in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And it was entitled, "What a Colored Man Should Do to Vote." It began on page 2 with these words: "To the colored men of voting age in the southern states. As citizens of the United States, you cannot value too highly your right to vote, which is an expression of your choice of the officers who shall be placed in control of your nearest and dearest interests. You should vote in every election. In national and congressional elections, vote for the best interests of your country. In local elections, vote for the best interests of the community in which you live." And then it said, "Never sell your vote." Then on page 3, which I found interesting, was the following information. It's entitled, "The Things That Qualify a Colored Man to Vote in the Southern States." In order that you might know, it said, what will be demanded of you to vote under the constitutions and laws of the several southern states. We give below the substantial requirements to each, to wit, in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee, you must pay your poll tax. You must register and hold your certificate of registration. If you can read, and write, you can register. In Alabama, Louisiana, and South Carolina, if you can read and write, if you can't read and write, excuse me, you can register if you own $300 worth of property. In Arkansas and Georgia, you must pay your poll tax. In good old Florida, yes, I laugh too, Kentucky, Texas, and West Virginia, you must reside in the state. A man convicted of almost any crime, you could steal a pack of chewing gum, you will be barred from voting. 50 years ago, the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement risked their lives to secure the right to vote for every African American. They challenged a system that not only disenfranchised millions, countless, after continued protests, culminating in the violent confrontation on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. It was then known, at least in 1965, as the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. It not only protects African American voters, but has come to serve those in the Latino community, disabled persons, students, a wide range of other minorities, and vulnerable populations. One of the most important aspects of the Voting Rights Act has been Section 5, which keeps a watchful eye over states with a history of voting discrimination. Known as the Preclearance, this section requires certain states with a history of disenfranchising voters to get, in order to get any changes to their voting laws, they had to be or the federal say that those proposed changes do not, in fact, discriminate against others. This part of the law, along with other temporary provisions, or other impediments, was renewed and extended with broad bipartisan support multiple times until the year 2006. But then came 2013 and the devastating Supreme Court ruling in Shelby County versus Holder that rendered the Voting Rights Act of 1965 a shell of its former self. It literally gutted Section 5 by saying the formula used to figure out where it applied was now unconstitutional. No formula means no preclearance, which means no voter protection under Section 5 from new voting discrimination. Listen to what Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote in her dissent. She said, and I quote, "Throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you think you won't get wet." Shelby County, Alabama sent a chilling message to all Americans who continue to face politically motivated hurdles on their way to the ballot box. Those hurdles are indeed many. For years, the conservative right has been whipping up hysteria about mass illegal voting that simply does not exist, and continues to use it as fuel in an onslaught of new and ever more suppressive voting laws. The right has passed voter ID requirements that they know are hard to meet. Cut back on early voting that they know often increases voter participation. And in my years as pastor of 3 predominantly African-American churches in New Jersey and here in Florida, one of the main movements that we had during voting season was what was called Souls to the Polls. And in that time of the year, we rallied everyone in our congregations of voting age to go on Sunday after worship to early vote in elections. The far right has challenged early voting now to the point where they're cutting back that opportunity. And in so doing, those tactics have been effective. I myself experienced such tactics several years ago as president of the Daytona Beach Black Clergy Alliance, when I tried to expand early voting beyond DeLand. They were only going to early vote in DeLand, and I challenged it to the point where they eventually acquiesced, and we had voting early, not only in DeLand, but also in Daytona Beach. Disenfranchisement for all Black voters has been a common roadblock to equality at the polls before and after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. For the country's current two-party system, more Black candidates at the local and state levels may help usher in new generations of voters to the polls and even more electoral visibility for alternative political parties. But as Brown, Reed, and Berry of the NAA Legal Defense Fund all stressed, to reduce Black voters to an indivisible unit is to deny African Americans voter singular identities and distills the implied cohesion of the, quote, Black vote to a simple matter of opposition to racial inequality, while bypassing the broad range of political issues white voters can prioritize, like economic uncertainty, religious freedom, environmentalism, and the list goes on. Black politics are more complex than simply a shared opposition to racial discrimination. The idea of a Black vote is itself historically specific and is bound up in a circular argument. It's assumed that the definitive concern for Black Americans is all about race. To assume that all Black Americans are concerned about racial justice and racial equality slides into a classification issue. That is, it reduces Black Americans' concerns to issues that supposedly have to do with racial classification and contends that the only question bearing direct or explicitly on race is all that matters to an African American. What marks the boundaries of Black politics? Racial justice and equality are important to all African Americans, but it doesn't end there. What we think of as the Black vote is a product of a racially defined interest group politics that emerged as the consolidation of the victorious social movements of the 1960s. In that interest group, people's interests can be reduced to what elites about a whole lot of things. We're concerned about women's issues. We're concerned about sexual identities and the crisis that so many face in having a sexual identity. We're concerned about the politics that go on in unions across the country. And then there are arguments about political campaigns as not being Black specific. There are more Black people in the United States than the entire population of Canada. Do Canadian voters have Canadian essentialism? In the US, income inequality has been increasing across the board since the 1960s and 1970s. This is a function of a capitalist class dynamic, not simply race. And that's true even in the worsening economic conditions that are experienced in the Black community. If what's understood to be a Black agenda is erasing disparities, you don't address the general system of inequality in that fashion. In a disparities framework, Black people disappear in every dimension of life except racial status. There's no room for even imagining the interests of postal workers, homeowners, railroad maintenance workers, parents, students, athletes, lawyers, doctors, and the list could go on. In a polity here accepts the agenda of the people who are at the top. Let me repeat that because that just went. In a polity defined by the democratic selection of leadership, things go fine when the lower tier accepts the agenda of the people who are at the top. At the moment that the lower tier acts up or acts out or does something that is not acceptable, the top tries to reduce their access. After the defeat of the populist insurgency in the 1890s, and since Ronald Reagan empowered the right wing, the majority went after disenfranchisement. The main reason to just disenfranchise voters is to actively take Black people out of the political equation for two reasons. Number one, because of racism. Number two, in the opinion of the right, Black people voted the wrong way. If Black voters had voted with the right wing, disenfranchisement as we know it would not exist. Now in the 21st century, there's no question the Republican Party has been openly and stealthily disenfranchising Black and minority voters. The objective is to disenfranchise Black people, but even deeper, to disenfranchise people who aren't voting Republican. Reducing the Black vote to an indivisible block helps with all of this. Black voting rights have a long history of being denied, suppressed, contested, defrauded, and obstructed. In the early years of Reconstruction, formerly enslaved men in the South voted for Black Republicans in the party of Lincoln. Believe it or not, there were Black Republicans in Reconstruction that ran for office. During this era, Black men became state, and national office holders in numbers that have yet to be surpassed. Entire communities of women as well as men turned out on election day, testifying to the importance of voting. Abandonment by the federal government in 1877 left Black voters vulnerable to terrorist tactics by the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow laws, which subsequently defrauded Black Southerners of the right to vote. The historic shift, because there was a shift that took place, and that shift in African-American national political party affiliation came in the 1930s. Prior to the 1930s, African-Americans by and large were voting Republican because Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves. They felt it was incumbent upon them to return that gesture to Lincoln by being supportive of what was then the Republican Party. But in the 1930s, during the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, a feminist social reformer who, unlike her husband, was connected politically and personally to many Black educators and activists, including our own beloved Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, who founded Bethune-Cookman University, where I have a Doctor of Divinity myself, advocated for programs and policies that ultimately helped sway Black voters to support the Democratic Party. It was at that moment that we began to see the shift, moving away from the Republican Party as African Americans toward what was then more liberal attitudes of Democrats. Historians now judge FDR harshly for the half measures of his policies and his continued pandering to Southern racist Democrats. But the historic shift in party affiliation had already begun to take place. The quandary for Black voters today is to be a minority population in a political system with only two major parties in which the winner takes all. In such a system, the diverse interests of African-American voters can rarely be represented. Subsequently, a small sub-portion of African-American voters have become Republicans because they're tired of being taken for granted by the Democratic Party. And that saddens me as the president of the Volusia County Democratic Black Caucus. But a shift, I'm happy to say, a shift is now taking place. Since the disappointment of African Americans in number 45, as evidenced by the landslide South Carolina victory that put Joseph R. Biden in the driver's seat, following Biden's unprecedented victory, Texas immediately went to work, propagating the big lie of an election fraud. They crafted a new voting rights bill that was so egregious that Democratic legislators in Texas fled the state by bus and plane and went to Washington, D.C. to prevent the passing of this bill. Ultimately, however, they did return. The bill was passed by the Republican majority, and it's now waiting for the certain signature of Governor Greg Abbott. Battles like this have only just begun. There will be more subversive tactics by Republican legislators in many of these southern states to limit voting access in an attempt to suppress the Black vote. In years past, when political parties lost an election, they went back, huddled up, assessed their weaknesses, and if necessary, amended their party platform and reached out to voters beyond their base in an effort to win them in the next election. But in the late 20th and 21st century, tactics reveal a totally different strategy. The tactic now is solely bent on disenfranchisement, not winning over those that you didn't have vote for you before, but stopping them from voting altogether. However, when minorities become the majority, and social scientists say that's going to happen in 2044, Republicans will have to change their tactics to win over this new majority if they intend to win elections. In the meantime, the bleed has begun. The right is shrinking its base. And because of that, if they would wake up and smell the roses and realize that if they had a party platform that reached out to people of all ethnicities, they would be able to throw a lifeline to many who support what they believe in. But because they are taking a different tactic, we see that base continuing to shrink. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share my insights with you today. And I look forward, if I haven't offended too many of you, to one day coming back to speak to you again, and maybe next time it will be as an African-American minister of the gospel. Thank you very much.